I just want to welcome all of you to this wonderful event. This is the second in our 2020 series on making democracy work. This is the second year we've done this. This is a collaboration between the Marin County League of Women Voters and the Sonoma County League of Women Voters. It's just been so much fun to do this. We're happy to welcome Marin League members and Sonoma League members. And I believe we have some folks, in addition to our speakers, we have other folks from Sonoma State University who are joining us today. I'm really excited to say we have students presenting, which is going to be terrific. Students from Dr. David McEwen's senior seminar on political science. And these folks are going to really bring us a perspective that we maybe don't get to hear enough. So Lynn, would you like to give people some Zoom information before we get started?
Sure. Just some housekeeping tips before we get rolling. We are recording the meeting, so if you'd like to not be seen on camera, please turn off your video. Also, if you could keep yourself muted during the presentation, that would be very helpful. If you have any questions, we're going to ask questions after each presentation. And the process would be, please put your question in the chat. Ann Wakely will read your question to whomever you're addressing it to at the appropriate time. But please feel free to put the questions in the chat as you think of them, and that way we'll be sure to answer your questions. We will be putting some other information in the chat that you might be interested in. So please check that out. And now I'd like to, and if you want to save the chat, please go to the box where the chat is. There are 3 dots. And if you click on those 3 dots, you have the opportunity to save the chat on your own computer. So anything that's in there can be saved for you. So with that, I'd like to introduce Debbie McKay, and please take it away.
Thanks, Lynn. Yes, so I wanted to thank Dr. David McEwen also for being a part of this collaboration for this presentation. We have worked with him to bring you 2 of his students from his senior seminar class who will be presenting today. And Dr. McEwen is well known as being an expert on political science. He is on the faculty of Sonoma State University, joined them in the fall of 2003, and some of his expertise is in broad areas like American politics and international relations. He has a doctorate that was granted from the University of California, Riverside, and he does research in 2 areas. So he does state and local elections, and he also studies terrorism. He is teaching both international and national politics, international security and terrorism, state and local politics, campaigns and elections, and political behavior. He was a Fulbright scholar during 2009-2010, working with the Department of International Relations and European Studies. And so you can see we have a very knowledgeable and very acclaimed person joining us today. And we're just delighted that he's included us in his students' semester, I guess would be the best way to put it. And he's worked with them on their presentations, and he's going to be introducing them today and sharing a little information about each of them. So I'll turn it over to you, Dr. McEwen.
Okay, thank you all very much for being here. It's a real treat to work with both leagues. I teach a course on senior seminar. It's a capstone course in our program. I will teach this course this semester and also in the fall, and wanted to begin doing more with the leagues and doing more about the state of our democracy and trying to join political science with better attention to issues of political reform, political performance, and kind of the conditions of our democracy. If you think about the attack on liberal democracies, if you think about what's going on in the world and where we've been the last 4, 5, 6 years, 10 years, 20 years, there really is a crisis of legitimacy for democracy. So what we'd like to do is partner better with the league and really use these 2 students as a way to do more and begin that conversation. What comes out of senior seminar is a longer tome, a senior thesis that looks at or examines a problem and looks at it from a political science point of view. So we've tried to do that here initially. The final product is due until mid-May. And we have two students with us, Haley and Will, who are going to talk to you today about issues of making democracy work better from a different perspective. First, Haley is going to go, and then will go. Let me tell you a little bit about Haley, and then I'll introduce Will when it's his time. Haley is a fourth-year student at SSU. She's a senior. This is her last semester. She intends to take the LSAT in June, and then hopefully go to law school, not this fall, but the following fall. I asked each student to tell me something interesting about each of them. And in Haley's spare time, she rides and show horses in competition. So I'm sure that this will feel much easier than that. And with that, let me just introduce her topic. Her topic is going to look at propaganda and the restriction of voting rights and how fake news reshapes American voting laws. She'll go for, again, about 15 or 20 minutes. We'll take a brief pause, and then I'll introduce Will. That's the plan for today. Haley, why don't I turn it over to you?
Awesome. Thank you so much. Just going to share my screen really quick and get it all started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for allowing Will and I to present our research projects to you from where they are so far. So my name is Haley Provencher, as Professor McCuan just introduced, and today I'll be taking you through my research project, which will examine the use of propaganda in mass media and how it affects the restriction of voting rights, and how fake news has reshaped American voting laws and the future of American voting rights in the US. So to give you guys a little introduction and kind of overview on my research and the issues at play, this study will examine voting rights in the US, specifically looking at what voting rights looks like following the 2020 presidential election, to examine how the Republican Party's use of propaganda has impacted the restriction of them. A little overview. Voting rights in the US have made great leaps forward to provide all citizens with the equal right and opportunity to vote. However, following the recent events of the 2020 election and all its aftermath, the Republican Party and its members have sought to start enforcing more restrictions on citizens' voting rights. And this is a concern to us as political scientists, but it should genuinely be a concern to all US citizens as it affects all of us. So a little kind of more overview. Following their loss of power in the 2020 election, Republicans began utilizing propaganda to spread false information in the media about the legitimacy of the election results, sort of in an attempt to regain power and create this false narrative about voter fraud in the election. However, as this false narrative about voter fraud has been pursued, it also places citizens' voting rights at risk for being restricted, which is problematic for making democracy work in the US, and it can be problematic to have political parties that are trying to pursue or restrict any form of citizens' rights or reshape American democracy in a negative light. Oh, sorry, what was that? Okay, sorry, thought I heard something. So kind of to give you guys a little discussion and overview on the public's perception of this issue. Since the 2020 election and the beginning of the spread of propaganda about voter fraud, there has been an increasing concern and kind of focus on voting rights and citizens' access to them. As we can see in this Pew Research Center's public opinion poll, they have reported that in 2021, so after the 2020 election, Democrats and their voters were more likely to favor less restrictive voting rights and were favoring to make it easier for citizens to vote, such as supporting making Election Day a national holiday or automatically registering all eligible citizens to vote. Whereas on the flip side, Republicans and their voters were and are more likely to favor increasing voting rights barriers, such as requiring a government-issued photo ID when you go to vote. Because citizens' perceptions and beliefs on voting rights restrictions can differ depending on their party affiliation, it does raise the questions of why do voters from different political parties believe or support two different stances in regards to voting rights restrictions, and what has recently influenced the change in their perceptions. So the public's negative perception of the 2020 election results and legitimacy of the current voting laws has really driven this research forward as we seek to address the influences on voting rights barriers and all the support behind them. So from this research, there are several implications that can be drawn from it, being that following the 2020 election, Republicans began making efforts to implement voting rights barriers to, as they would put it, ensure the integrity and security of election results. However, all these efforts by them have infringed upon citizens' fundamental and constitutional right to vote. The use of propaganda to spread false information and manipulate the public is not a new tactic, but it must be prevented before it degrades the integrity of American democracy and becomes a part of the US political system in general. And an overarching kind of implication that will be drawn from this research is that the use of propaganda has really forced people to kind of review the media, social media, and news outlets under a more critical or even defensive lens, which can have a positive and negative impact on how the public receives their information. So kind of in retrospect as to why this research matters, and especially why it would be significant to the leagues, is because it investigates the restriction of an essential function to American democracy, voting rights and citizens having access to them, and seeks to identify and prevent outside influences from promoting the restriction of them. While previous research and scholars have tried to address either the overall impact of propaganda or how voting rights have changed throughout the decades, this study will aim to fill the gap and make the connection between the exaggeration of propaganda on voter fraud and how it affects voting rights directly. All right, so kind of getting into the research a little bit more, the intended research question that I'm going to be asking and then addressing asks, how has the Republican Party's use of propaganda to exaggerate voter fraud in the 2020 election affected if voting rights are restricted or not? By answering and addressing this question, we will be able to identify negative influences on and support voting rights barriers, and we will be able to block measures or efforts by political parties or members who are seeking to reshape American voting rights or democracy for their own benefit or agendas. And by answering and addressing these issues, we will be able to find ways to preserve democracy and democratic values in the US. So kind of breaking the research down even more into some basic components, especially from our research question, we have our independent and dependent variables that are as follows. Our dependent variable is voting rights and whether they'll be restricted or not, depending on the influence from our independent variables, which are the use of propaganda, specifically by Republicans, the exaggeration of voter fraud in the media, misinformation spread throughout multiple media outlets, and state voting laws varying by state. Now, all four of our independent variables would have a negative relationship or connection to our dependent variable and would influence the restriction of them. However, our fourth independent variable, state voting laws, as it kind of fluctuates and may vary, so can their influence on the restriction of voting rights. So the proposed hypotheses, and then on the flip side, the null hypotheses of this research project states, the original hypotheses that if there is an increase in the Republican Party's use of propaganda, an increase in the exaggeration of voter fraud, misinformation increases throughout the media outlets, and state voting laws continue to fluctuate, then there will be an increase in voting restrictions. However, on the flip side, the alternative or null hypothesis states, if fewer media outlets run propaganda about voter fraud, misinformation doesn't spread, and state voting laws don't change, then the level of voting restrictions will decrease. So kind of at this point in my research project and leading up to where we are, there were several notable things that stood out in my preliminary research and in the initial findings from Lori Menight's New Challenges in the Study of Right-Wing Propaganda, and then the Brennan Center's article on digital disinformation and voter suppression. So in Lori Menight's literature, we see that there have been efforts throughout the 2000s to restrict the right to vote, make it difficult for citizens to access their voting rights. And again, throughout the 2000s, there have been propaganda campaigns displayed by the Republican Party to promote their agendas. And these propaganda campaigns that were displayed by the Republicans all throughout the 2000s and stuff were used to instill paranoid stories, and especially to construct this myth about voter fraud as a foundation for attacking the voting rights of the minorities or the poor. And in the Brennan Center's literature, we see that starting after the 2010 election, legislators in nearly half the states began passing new laws to make it harder for citizens to vote. And again, after the 2016 election, several more voting restrictions were implemented. Especially from the Brennan Center's literature, we kind of see and get the indication that legislators are utilizing election cycles and election years to pursue their agendas of restricting voting rights. And it's problematic, but also kind of ironic, as they're asking citizens to vote for their right to vote to be revoked or revised. From our kind of initial findings in the preliminary research that we've done so far, we can kind of get the idea that Republican legislators have wanted to restrict voting rights in the past and have been waiting for the right opportunity or maybe another election cycle to push another massive effort to implement more voting rights restrictions. And the quote unquote or so on right opportunity might have been following the 2020 election and all the uproar about Trump losing to illegitimate election results or because of voter fraud. That could have been the right spark for them to kind of push another massive effort. And so as the research continues to unfold, we expect to kind of find that propaganda to exaggerate voter fraud, especially in the 2020 election, can influence the implementation of voting rights barriers all across the US. And we also expect to find that the ability for propaganda to successfully influence voting rights restrictions is geographically centered and depending on how large of a presence or influence that the Republican Party has in the state. So like, for example, in a state where the Republican Party has a larger influence, we would probably expect to find that there are more voting rights barriers and restrictions versus in a state where the Republican Party does not have such a large influence. There could be less voting rights barriers and restrictions. And a big kind of overarching point that I am expecting to find and hoping not is that the use of propaganda to justify or encourage the restriction of voting rights, or even the use of propaganda to pursue political agendas, could become a part of the American political system if it's not identified and prevented from happening in the future. So kind of in conclusion for where the research stands right now and as it continues to unfold, is that the research is significant to conduct, and especially to the League, because a fundamental aspect of democracy in the US is that citizens do have the ability and right to vote in free and fair elections. And US citizens' voting rights must be protected and not restricted in an attempt to make it difficult for certain groups to vote or for political parties to only get their voter base to support them. Because the restriction of voting rights affects all citizens and disrupts an essential democratic value in the US, it's crucial to research how the Republican Party's use of propaganda affects the regulation and restriction of voting rights and how we can prevent it from happening in the future. All citizens should have the right to vote free from government intervention, and the use of propaganda to restrict or even weaken the legitimacy of voting rights must be prevented altogether. If the use of propaganda to further a political agenda goes unnoticed or quite frankly even unpunished, it could become a part of our political system and used to further infringe on even more rights of citizens. Kind of wrapping up too, like analyzing propaganda and how it impacts an essential democratic value like voting rights will help us find ways to preserve democratic values in the US and find ways to make democracy continue to work in the US. Because for democracy to prevail and for citizens' voting rights to remain intact, we must block any effort utilized to undermine or reshape the future of American democracy in any negative light. So kind of from where my research is and what I've presented to you guys so far, I kind of just had a little question to have you guys kind of ponder on and think about, being, have you recently noticed or been able to identify things in the media as propaganda that you haven't seen before? Have you seen, more instances of propaganda in the media in recent years and stuff like that? Just kind of wrapping up, there is also appendix slides where I further outline my conceptual model and dive a little bit deeper into my independent and dependent variables and how I will measure them throughout my project. Thank you so much for allowing me to present my project to you and for taking the time out of your day to be here with us. And thank you.
Haley, thank you very much for doing that. That was very kind. We appreciate that. Also, as you look at and think about Haley's senior seminar paper, obviously the effect of voting rights, the effect of fake news, and the discussion around propaganda or what voters are being exposed to is a huge component of this is obviously misinformation, and that the misinformation can lead to an erosion of confidence. You have an election 57 days from now, that's the primary, and then an election about 210 days from now, the general election, all gearing up from 2022 to a huge presidential election in 2024. So as both of these students kind of look at these materials, they are joined in some sense by voting laws, the discussion of fake news, together with the role of propaganda and misinformation. So the next paper by Will Stephenson, Will's paper examines this critical role of misinformation and how misinformation can erode confidence in democratic institutions. Will is also a senior. In his fourth year, he had a 2-year gap where he worked in banking and the quantitative side of that. He's also headed to law school, not right away. He hopes to take a gap year in Ireland. And if there is a nerd's nerd, it would definitely be Will. He is either spending his time writing or working for school or writing notes for his Dungeons and Dragons group. So that's one element of Will's background, and I think that you'll see his interesting kind of discussion and take here on the role of misinformation as it lends itself to the crisis of legitimacy that we're seeing with democracy, and particularly with American democracy. Will, the floor is yours.
Oh boy, all right. Thank you, Dr. McEwen. Yeah, that was an introduction, wasn't it? So I'm gonna go ahead and screen share here. Let's see, we got this. Beautiful. So just to kind of ride this wave of Haley's great presentation, I'm going to be talking about the ever so popular and chipper topic of misinformation, and kind of how that erodes confidence in democratic institutions and therefore affects voting legislation. So to start, just kind of a quick overview. My research is looking to address the impact that misinformation has on the support and therefore the acceptance of voting rights laws that act more as voting suppression laws in the United States. I'll be utilizing inductive research, kind of working backwards, using COVID-19 vaccination rates as kind of an indicator for the prevalence of misinformation in the community. And looking at this allows us to kind of address the social issues that are allowing for this kind of broad support of these voting laws that are being passed that undermine the rights of everyone. Now it's more targeted, but it does affect everyone. And if we don't pay attention to it more collectively, it has the potential to strip voting rights at an exponential rate, relatively unseen as it becomes more and more surgical and subtle throughout time. So why this research matters. If we allow these restrictive laws to take hold and cement themselves as legitimate in the eyes of the general public, we begin to open our democratic institutions to more severe tampering. So only by examining and understanding the ways in which these laws have been accepted by the general population can we begin to make the necessary changes that allow us to strengthen rather than weaken our democracy and our democratic institutions. So the first thing I'd like to do here before we get in is just kind of solicit from the group, if you're comfortable, it's not a requirement. In the chat, if you could just type in a number between 1 and 5, 1 being your confidence, you have no confidence in how the 2020 election turned out, and 5 being super confident and you were positive everything went the way it's supposed to. And then either putting a D, an R, or an I for party affiliation as well. Just kind of get a gauge on this before I continue. Again, totally optional. So I'll just for maybe 10 seconds. I'm not sure how long. And then I'll, pull that over here. Okay. Great. Awesome. Right. Cool. Okay. Well, thank you everybody who participated in that. I appreciate it. So it'll help kind of give some context to this next part here. So if we look at this graph, this is a graph conducted by Gallup following the 2020 election, showing confidence in the accuracy of US elections by political party, people self-identified. So what I'm seeing in the chat here is consistent with this graph, actually more consistent. I think we're about 100% in the chat with confidence. But this graph shows that in the 2020 election, there was a 30-point gap between confidence between Republican leaning individuals and Democratic leaning individuals. This again has been reflected in the chat with pretty much everybody who self-identified as Democratic or Democratic leaning giving it top marks for confidence in the election. So it is consistent with this poll that was done and the data that I've so far collected. So it kind of behooves us to take a deeper look at who makes up these demographics and why these demographics matter. So if we look at these demographics from the Pew Research Center, on the left, we have registered voters by race and by political identification. And then on the right, we have the lean of the independents who were registered independent by race as well. So we can see among white people, there's not too much it's pretty evenly split, even amongst independent lean. It's pretty even, fluctuating a little bit over time, but not too much. If we look at Black people and their votes, we see that even, at its peak, 6% of registered voters were Republican, and among independents, there was a massive 70+ point gap between the lean of independents. We can see a similar gap, not quite as severe, among Hispanic registered voters, with the independent lean again being pretty significant. So to kind of give an example of this, if we look at a state that was more contested in the 2020 election, such as Georgia, Georgia is roughly, according to the most recent census, roughly 60% white, 33% Black, and roughly the remaining 7% being other groups of people of color. So if we look at that and we look at how this plays out, and we assume that this is a framework for how votes will be divided, already Republicans or conservative individuals have lost 30% of the state votes just off of the white vote alone. So from that, it becomes statistically the chance of an outright popular vote majority win becomes statistically unlikely. So why does this matter? How do we close this gap? If I was looking at this and saying, I don't want to lose, how do I close this gap? Well, the Brennan Center did some research that allows us to look at this map here. I'm not sure why they used the lightest color blue imaginable, almost white, to highlight the states that were restrictive, but that's what they chose to do. So between January 1st and December 7th of 2021, at least 19 states passed 34 restrictive laws. So they passed almost 2 restrictive laws apiece inside of 1 year. And a lot of those states we can see are more conservative leaning, and a lot are centered in the southern area. We do have states like Idaho, Arizona, and then we have, Texas, Florida, Georgia, that have passed these more restrictive laws that are aimed at kind of closing that gap that we saw on the previous demographic slide. On the opposite side, we see the states where there are only expansive laws are passed, such as making mail-in ballots or equitable access to voting universal in more democratic leaning states, obviously California, Washington, Oregon, Maine even. And then we have some states that passed kind of mixed laws. So this is important to look at just because it allows us to see kind of where these things are happening and why they are more severe than the expansive laws are positive. While the expansive laws are incredibly positive, the weight that they carry doesn't carry the same weight as stripping someone's right to vote. So providing more equitable access is fantastic, but I know in Sonoma County where I live, we've had the availability to vote by mail for as long as I've been a registered voter. So making that universal statewide is awesome, but it doesn't carry the same weight. It doesn't kind of tip the scales the same way that someone telling me I need to bring 2 forms of voting ID to the booth on that day only between, 8 and 4, 8 and 6 on a day that I'm probably working. That's far more impeding to my right to vote than allowing me to vote by mail. So how does this affect democracy? How do these gap closing laws, these restrictive laws affect democracy? As severe as it sounds, everything that I've looked at shows me that widespread disenfranchisement is not something we can conclusively rule out as a possibility if these trends continue. We've seen this kind of fear-based reaction to bar the door effect in more than one state, with a lot of those conservative states shown on the Brennan Center map passing legislation that's passed under the guise of strengthening voting systems, but really creates kind of a one-sided system that allows for more severe, I want to say tampering, but it allows for more restricted voting. With the demographics changing, and we've seen, Republican and conservative votes drying up, there's an urge to kind of insulate themselves in order to prevent further deterioration of their voting base due to those changing demographics of the United States as a whole. This is being done by targeting access for minority groups that overwhelmingly, as we saw in the demographics, vote for Democratic and Democratic-leaning candidates. So really the research that I'm doing aims to answer the question, what impact has misinformation had on voter suppression in the United States? So really looking at how misinformation has played a role in allowing legislation to be passed that suppresses people's rights to vote. So my null hypothesis, this is super clinical, so I apologize. As the percentage of vaccinated citizens in a region decreases, the level of belief in conspiracy theory increases, the geographic location is less densely populated, and political ideology is less liberally inclined, the public support for voter suppression laws will increase. So this kind of creates a base level for us to be able to examine this question and say, what are we looking for? What is our alternate choice? So the alternate choice really is that as we look at regions where vaccination rates are increased, I've set threshold levels for this that are probably super boring for anyone who doesn't do this professionally. As they increase, the level of belief in conspiracy theory decreases, the geographic location becomes more densely populated, and the political ideology of the region leans more liberally. The public support for restrictive voting laws that act as voter suppression will decrease. So in some of my initial findings in the research that we've conducted, and we'll have a more comprehensive paper that we can submit at the end of the semester, as Dr. McEwen said, is that COVID-19 vaccination rates have proved a reasonable indicator for the prevalence of misinformation in a community. I've seen that there is a connection. Misinformation prevalence is more common in Republican and conservative leaning geographic areas. And when looking at maps of where restrictive legislation has been passed, and maps of where vaccination rates of COVID-19 are low, there is an overlap. So when I look at maps where, like the Brennan Center map, where those laws have been passed, and then a map of where vaccination rates are low, they do line up pretty well. I am trying to find a way to account for equitable access to vaccines and healthcare as kind of a confounding variable in my research, because I want to make sure that there's no influence that's not related specifically to this and that isn't affecting my percentage rates as I go forward. And the last initial finding is that areas with more misinformation prevalence, as indicated by the vaccination rates, and with more Republican identifying individuals are most likely to have passed those restrictive voting laws, with the inverse being true of Democratic leaning areas. So the implications of all of this, right? In the wake of the 2020 election, we saw a lot of areas, as the Brennan Center pointed out, and passed voting reform laws that effectively amount to forms of voter suppression. These laws are being passed by utilizing misinformation as the basis for their drafting, and then using more information to justify their passing and any criticism that comes forth surrounding the law itself. So really, this paper and this research is aiming to understand why people are willing to accept this and misinformation under the guise that it will never be their rights that will be impacted. Why utilizing the idea of the other is a powerful tool in structuring democratic institutions for whomever. It doesn't have to be one party or the other, whomever, and allows them to kind of surgically and subtly choose and cut things as they want. And then again, the disenfranchisement is not something that I'm willing to rule out until I've finished this paper. Maybe it is something I'll rule out in the end, and I hope to God that it is, but everything showing me so far is that we're trending in a direction that is more restrictive. So the question and how it's relevant to society is really looking at the reality of who's allowed to vote and how easily they can vote, and the way that it's trending in not necessarily a positive direction in a lot of areas of the country. I do know that in some areas, as I pointed out, there have been expansive laws that have been passed, which is a positive trend. But again, the weight of those positive trends isn't as heavily weighted, sorry for the redundancy, as what's carried in restrictive laws. So as new laws are passed and voting becomes more difficult, we as political science scholars, people that are involved in election law, activism, we have to look at ways of protecting our voting institutions and ensure that disenfranchisement doesn't happen subtly, and definitely not as overtly as it's been happening. So my question to ponder is just, what kind of subtle changes in our democratic institutions have you noticed in the recent years that have the potential to maybe snowball into something more severe? And with that, I as well have some more clinical slides that I've included. I'm happy to share that with anyone or present that to anyone that would like to see variables operationalized. Please just let Lynn or Ann know, and I'm happy to send those over and give a brief rundown on those. So thank you again, everyone, for taking the time to join us on your lunch to listen to these really upbeat, super positive topics. And I hope this was at least semi informational, and that you can do something fun before you have to go back to work or whatever it is for the day, and kind of cleanse yourself of this. So yeah, thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you both very much. Debbie, I think the floor is yours.
We're going to move to questions now. So if you haven't put a question in the chat, please do. And we do have a few questions. So we will begin with some of the questions that are in the chat. And like I say, you can continue to add to those. So we have a question for Haley. What do you think can be done to stop the spread and impact of propaganda?
Awesome. So I love this question. It's obviously very applicable to my research and then what I'm trying to address. So I think some things that can be done to help stop the spread of propaganda is that the first thing that needs to be done is that the public should be educated, I think, a little bit further on examples of propaganda, but also especially extreme examples of propaganda to further a political agenda. And then from the public being able to identify it, then they could take it in from their own initiative to then fact check the information and to see. I also think that kind of to make a bigger impact on stopping the spread of propaganda, especially that's being utilized by political organizations or groups, that like small citations or something could kind of be implemented for those that use extreme versions of propaganda to achieve their political agendas. So that way there is sort of like a repercussion or negative consequence associated with using these extreme examples. So it's a little bit less of an incentive for these organizations to utilize it.
Thank you. So Will, I'm going to put this one to you. This person states that they don't watch news that they believe is misinformation. And that kind of fits with what you were talking about when you were showing the different belief systems of the political parties. So in general, do you feel people only watch news that they're inclined to already believe? And if that is true, how does that impact your research?
Yeah, so that's a really good question that I've been spending some time on. I haven't fully fleshed out the conclusion to that question, but I will say that there is evidence to suggest, just through, sociology and different forms of social science, that there is a tendency to spend more time with things that affirm your biases. So any kind of news outlet, anything that kind of reaffirms your held beliefs, you're more likely to engage with. So it's not guaranteed. I know there are a lot of people who spend time looking at a lot of different news sources and doing comparison to make sure that their information is correct. But that is something that I'm running into as kind of a, not necessarily a confounding variable, it's something that I'm having to navigate around to make sure that I'm not looking at, thank you, Dr. That threw me. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I do think there is a trend of that, and that is something that I have to be cognizant of as I'm conducting this research and making sure that I'm aware that some of this is going to be more tied to individual belief systems. Hopefully that answers that question. I think I got all of it.
Okay, thank you. So this next question is for both of you, and you can decide who wants to go first. How do you think the Supreme Court's consequential 2013 ruling in Shelby County versus Holder impacted voter suppression?
I can kind of just go first, just kind of rolling off of it. So initially in my research too, I did look into this case, the Shelby County versus Holder, and in their ruling that held the coverage formula in Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act to be unconstitutional, which essentially makes it harder for Black voters in states that were affected by the Voting Rights Act to access their voting rights. And it allows states to kind of determine their own voting rights laws and barriers if they wish to implement them. So that decision kind of does open the door for states to enforce their own voting rights barriers if they wish to, which does impact how voting rights can change throughout the US.
Yeah, I mean, Haley covered most of that. I think, yeah, it is something that has affected for sure the way in which these kind of things can change and morph over time, and at the the rate at which they can happen. And so I think it has had a pretty significant impact on what we're seeing and the way things are shifting. And as we saw, 34 laws inside of a year. So the rate is pretty, I don't want to say exponential, but compared to the last couple of years, it's kind of an exponential growth. And so I think this kind of allows for that to move more rapidly.
Thank you. So Haley, you had talked about propaganda, and propaganda is essentially protected under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. So how do you regulate, or how do you deal with propaganda when it's really one of our rights under the Constitution?
Yeah, and I think, and this is where, for me, I think it'll kind of unfold a little bit more as I do my research, because it is protected. You can't quite just be like, propaganda's, illegal, can't do it, can't use it. But I would think that maybe extreme versions of propaganda could be not fully eliminated, but maybe regulated or a little bit better, just so that way, like, propaganda is a version essentially of free speech, so it can be utilized, but maybe an extreme use of propaganda to inflict harm, inflict violent occasions could be kind of regulated a little bit more specifically, especially in relation to elections, election laws, and the integrity of it.
So you've mentioned regulation several times. Can you give us an example of what that regulation might look like? Like what would those regulations be? Who would enforce them?
Yes, so on that, I'm not entirely sure if I kind of would need to do a little bit more research and kind of let this play out a little bit more. So I could definitely include that in my final paper and report that back to you guys.
Great. So Will, we have one for you. Did your research confirm that vaccination rates are related to conspiracy theories and voting rights, or is that still just a hypothetical part of your study and your research?
Yeah, so what I've gotten so far, in kind of taking some time to connect all of this, the vaccination rates I'm using as an indicator for misinformation prevalence. And that's kind of my measure for conspiracy. So it's kind of a 3-step process to get where I need to be. But there is research that suggests, and that I have concluded in my proposal to Dr. McEwen, that suggests that levels of areas with more severe or more, sorry, with higher levels of conspiracy theory beliefs do have lower vaccination rates. So when I look at that and I compare the two, that allows me to say, okay, this specific area is more likely to have a higher belief in conspiracy theories, and then look at what polls have been conducted there. Do they have polls such as, just a binary, is President Biden a legitimate president? Questions like that, which allow for that kind of extrapolation into what laws are going on there. That's kind of a long-winded way of saying it is still hypothetical in the most clinical of sense, but there is initial evidence in this research I've been doing to suggest that the vaccination rates are a pretty good indication of areas where voting rights laws do get passed more frequently and are more restrictive.
Okay, again, we have a question for both of you, and so I'll let you decide who's going to go first. We've been talking about the fact that people seem to kind of naturally believe certain information, and they tend to spread information that they believe, spread negative information or inaccurate information. So do you think this is a natural inclination that seems to be at the root of these pieces of misinformation spreading so rapidly and being accepted so readily? So have you come across any research or information that talks about why misinformation seems to spread like wildfire?
Yeah. So this is a great question that I don't have, the definitive answer to. I think that's probably a whole other paper. But initially what I've seen is that a lot of misinformation is focused around the idea of some enemy, some fear, some other, something that's waiting or looking to strip you of something. And so I think that when that is the basis of the information that's being presented, people have a natural inclination to go into that kind of, whether or not it's conscious, that response of, I need to protect people, I need to get this out. Whereas if I present information to you that's like, hey, we just signed a law that makes it so we're going to have buses to take people to voting, like there's no fear or there's nothing driving the spread of that, right? That's something that you can internalize and be like, great, that's, I'll make a note of that for when I need to go vote, if I need to, get on a bus. But when someone says something like, hi, they're coming to make sure that you cannot vote, that implicitly invokes this kind of fear response that goes, I need to share this with people so that we can do something about this, whether or not it's accurate information, whether or not it's truthful. The initial, I keep saying initial because I don't have this paper finalized, but it does show that kind of information spreads a lot faster and a lot more readily, based off of those kind of fear responses.
Haley, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, kind of going off of what Will was saying, I was going to say that I would expect to see that a little bit more as the research unfolds, and especially as we operationalize our variables. So I definitely will follow up with that in the paper and report back to the league.
Great, thank you. There's a theory of what is called negative mobilization and negative partisanship. This is kind of following up on our previous question. That is sometimes more stimulative about political behavior. Do you want to elaborate on that? Are you familiar with those two theories?
The idea is that negative information holds. And so this misinformation propaganda kind of component, or junk food politics, I often call it, people consume it, they stimulate, it's more educative, but it also has tremendous downsides. And what it means by educative is people learn a lot more, but in the process of learning a lot more, they're stimulated in the negative. And there does seem to be, it may be spurious with the vaccination rates or other components, but it does seem to be this component where people are stimulated by the negative that brings them in, but doesn't hold them in the electorate, if you will, or they cast the negative ballot or negative partisanship, but they don't stay, or they lash out. And this presents, I think, some real problems for moving forward about questions of legitimacy or dealing with misinformation, all the issues. I tried to put an idea out there that all the questions that have been raised so far, I think.
So do either of you want to respond or elaborate on that?
I think kind of what I was talking about does have to do with that kind of negative retention, where you kind of internalize good information and you hold on to the bad. Like, I think it's cliche example of, you know, in a relationship, you're not going to focus on all of the super great things that have happened in a 30-year marriage. Maybe you will, but in my experience, when I've talked to people, they focus more on like, damn, that one thing that he does really bothers me. And that's the thing that sticks with you. And that's the thing you want to talk with your friends about. And not, you know, oh, he brought me dinner at work. So I think there's that kind of negative retention that Dr. McEwen's talking about, where we're naturally inclined to think about and hold on to these kind of false, not false, but more provocative beliefs that kind of play into that.
Yeah, and kind of rolling off of what Will and Professor McCuan were saying is that I do think that people also relay a little bit more of the negative message, kind of for that shock value, to kind of start the conversation about whatever it is they're aiming to get, and kind of hold on to that more than just stating the facts and giving the truth out.
Okay. Our president of Marin County, Ann Wakely, wants to ask a question, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to her for a minute.
Thank you, Debbie. I'm not sure if I really have a question formulated, but it has to do with the situation. What I'm thinking about, the situations where you have Republican legislatures and much more, possibly Democrat, but much more liberal governors in some states. So you have the electorate has chosen a governor that reflects much more liberal views. And so perhaps the laws that are being passed in the legislature don't really reflect the majority of the citizens' views about voting rights. And I just wonder if you've come across any research about that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I know, Haley, I think you've done a little bit more of this, but so I'll go quick and then I'll let you answer the rest of this. I've definitely seen areas in which the general populace, the kind of over the polling that they've done indicates a stronger preference towards more expansive laws, or even just kind of leaving things status quo. And the legislature doesn't reflect that in the legislation that they're introducing and passing, which is interesting. And I'll be watching even after this paper is done, midterms, to see if there's a shift following those kind of passing of legislations, to see if there's kind of some consequences that come from not reflecting the populace. So that'll be interesting. But Haley, I know you've touched on this way more.
Yeah, so part of like my operationalizing of my independent variable of state voting laws, will be looking at, like you were saying, how the structure of the state government, whether the governorship is held by a Republican or Democratic party, and then whether or not the state Senate is also held by that same party or not, being a unified state government structure, a mixed one, or a split one, and addressing the overall impact on that. But it'll definitely as the research unfolds, especially measuring the state voting laws, I do expect to see that the state government structure, whether the state governorship and the state Senate align or not, how that really does impact the overall state's voting rights barriers and restrictions that they implement or not.
Thank you. So I'm going to try to wrap it up with one final question because we're approaching our 1 o'clock time frame. So this is to both of you. Do you think that social media platforms such as Facebook need to be more responsible for self-regulation of false information, or should there be more oversight from the government?
I've been going first a lot. If you want to.
Okay. I actually do really like this question. And where I am in my research, I think that it would be more effective to have not these platforms like Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, whatever, having their like CEOs regulating false information, but I think that they could even add like an additional group or organization to their platform that is solely responsible for monitoring or regulating the platforms and any use of false information throughout it. I think that those additional groups could be the ones who hold the platforms accountable.
Yeah, I think, man, it's a tough one because on the one hand, we have the end user license agreements and things that people sign when they, things that no one ever reads, the terms of agreement when you sign up for an account on something. So when people are on Twitter and they get banned, and then people, argue that it's an infringement on First Amendment rights, then the lawyer part of me is like, no, you actually signed that. It's a private entity. It's not, federally regulated. You sign that so they can ban you because it's their platform. So I think it gets into a weird area of, I think that federal regulation would be nice, but the realist in me doesn't see it as a reality for these large corporations in any real effective manner. I think there could be guidance issued, but I think any regulatory committee that wants to tell Twitter or Facebook or any of these places that they're going to come in and kind of police their content, it gets very strange and very complicated. So I think, as Haley was saying, I think the best would be to have kind of inter-company kind of watchdog groups. I know they have things that flag, COVID tweets or Instagram posts, which is nice. But the problem with that is they just flag everything that mentions it. There's no real review unless someone brings it up for review. And then even then it can get, backlogged. And so I think there should be more regulation. It's a very tricky question of how we get there without creating a lot of weird circumstances that kind of give themselves feedback loops. And so I'd be curious to see how that evolves, but I would agree that I think there should be some more regulation.
Well, thank you both. We really appreciate the time you spent with us today. We appreciate you sharing your research papers with us and enduring our questions. And this has been just a delightful experience for all of us. And David, thank you very much for working with the League to make this possible. We really hope we can do more of these kind of partnerships in the future. It is very valuable to us to hear what younger people are thinking and what your research is and what you see as trends. That's really valuable to us. So we appreciate your time. We wish you well in whatever your next endeavor is. And we also invite you, while you're still students, to become free members of the League. We offer free membership in the League of Women Voters to anybody who's a college student. So we would welcome your continued participation as you move out into the world. And I think you're both going to make a difference. And it's really exciting to see that. So thank you very much.
I just want to add my thanks. This has just been terrific. Really excellent, both of you. I want to know how this research turns out. If you can tell us once you're done, maybe come back and give us a little presentation of the final results. I would love that.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Will, and thank you, Haley. You guys did great.
Thank you, everyone.
Good job.